Yes, it was counting down. So today I will be following Peter, who is my supervisor. I will be talking to you about my attempts at epigraphic palaeography and the way I use the Archetype suite of tools that he was introducing, and the way I'm customizing it to see, excuse me, if it can work for the analysis of inscriptions, because it was designed initially for manuscripts. And there will be some code in the end to make people happy. No, it should. No, it's not. I can click. OK. Right. So first, a bit of background. I'm looking at this bit here, the province of Thrace, which is multilingually a very interesting place. Why? Because in the kind of first few centuries of the Roman Empire, this territory was split from north to south into two provinces, Moesia and Thrace. In Moesia, the official language was Latin. In Thrace, the official language was kept as Greek. Later on, 3rd century, Diocletian comes in power, starts making administrative and taxation reforms, splits the territory the other way around, from west to east. So now the east bit, both north and south, becomes Thrace with official language Greek, and the west bit, both north and south, the whole thing, including Greece, becomes Moesia official language Latin. So you have the same piece of land split into two different ways for administrative and taxation purposes, with a mixture of administrative languages, Greek and Latin, kind of in various squares, right? So why does that matter, and what's the linguistic situation there to begin with? So first of all, the local population had their own language, or languages. We don't really know much about it. It's either one group of Thracian languages or a few related but not necessarily completely connected types of languages. They didn't have their own script. They used the Greek alphabet to inscribe things. So we can see the writing, we can recognize the letters, we can't read it and understand it. No way. So I'm not talking about it. I know nothing about it. There's very little we know. About 30 words are attested in various sources, etc. But that's just to say that the local population used both Greek and Latin as foreign languages of trade, administration, work, education, so on and so forth. Now, what happened with Greek? Greek arrived quite early on the coast, and then the Greeks, as they do, went into the interior for trading purposes, again, Hellenistic colonies, etc. So lots of Greek presence in that part of the world, linguistically and administratively, which is why later, when the Romans came round, they thought, OK, in the east, we keep the administrative language as Greek. In the west of the empire, we stick to Latin. Mostly. But that doesn't mean that everything written in the East is just in Greek. It means that the main administrative documents were in Greek or were bilingual, which is interesting. So in terms of the use of Latin in the territory, so the north bit, this bit started as Latin. The south bit was mainly Greek. However, administration and trade was also conducted in Latin, and all veteran settlements by default had to use Latin, because when you go to serve in the Roman army, when you're done with your service, you automatically become a Roman citizen with the full Roman rights, voting, representation, the whole thing, which includes the use of Latin. So even if you were born in Syria, you've served in the army, you become a Roman citizen, then you start inscribing in the expected language, which is Latin. So we have pockets of veteran settlements as well. And of course, there's a bunch of loan words coming both ways, from Greek to Latin and from Latin to Greek. The colony is kind of cute with the small omega here, etc. So this is linguistically what's going on. OK. Graphically, this is what's going on. So the first example, just a few pictures. We have a bilingual inscriptions. This is a paper squeeze, a paper impression, because we have lost with a stone don't know where it is. And the only thing we have is this impression. So the top bit, the top 3 lines you can see are Latin, the bottom ones, which appear more square, are Greek. This is a building inscription commemorating the building of the city walls in Philippopolis. And what's interesting is that the text they don't look exactly the same. There's a deliberate difference in the script. The Greek is more square, the Latin is more squished, as you would expect, a more administrative hand. And secondly, they don't say exactly the same thing, although they commemorate the same event. So the Latin says, in the year such and such, emperor such and such gave the city some money to fortify their walls. The Greek says, the glorious city of Philippopolis rebuilt their walls with funds provided by emperor such and such. So there's a clear difference in the message and which audience this message is directed to. So when I'm looking at palaeography, I'm also obviously inevitably looking at social factors, historical situation, status, and identity, because Philippopolis, as you can guess from the name, even within the confines of the Roman Empire, it still remained a mostly Greek-administered and Greek-speaking city. So clearly the more important message, the larger letters, more carefully executed, the message starting with the city's name rather than the emperor and the date. It's like, oh, we are independent, look how cool we are. And the Latin is there for administrative purposes. Just, you have to put it, right, like a logo, right? It has to be there. Another case is this, which is only Greek. There's nothing bilingual going on. But you can see in the writing this squiggle here, which is the diphthong OU. You don't normally see that on lapidary evidence. You see it in papyri, later on in books, etc. over here. So this happens a bit later on. This is obviously later. That's 3rd century. I call 3rd century later. This happens quite a lot later with some book interferences into the lapidary script, although the rest appears fairly monumental. So there's interference from various inscribing traditions as well. The last thing, it's kind of a horrible image. I apologize. That's why I've given a transcription. So it's written in Greek script, as you can see, but that is essentially a Latin inscription. So Dulca, the wife of Florinos, obviously it's 6th century, quite late, so the case system is collapsing. Florino is in some weird general case, whatever. But the point is somebody's writing Latin in Greek script, which is fairly odd. So this is what I'm dealing with, right? How do we analyze this? Okay. So going to what Peter was saying, I'll quickly introduce what Archetype is, and then I'll show you how the customizations that I've made. So for my purposes, I'm not analyzing, I'm not processing images, I'm not matching traces of letters or anything like that. I want to be able to describe things in a consistent way so that I can compare the Latin tradition of inscribing and the Greek tradition of inscribing. So for my purposes, I thought Archetype was perfect. So it does all of these amazing things. The palaeographer describes their own features according to their own discipline and tradition. Peter already introduced that. Is generalized for all kinds of script, which is great for me because I have 2 of them. And this is what you do in the back end of the framework. You define your categories of letterforms pedantically, as you should if you actually want to compare them with the machine. So in this case, I've defined the capital alpha. There it is. I've given it 4 different components, and these components, one of them, the crossbar, I have defined that in my corpus of inscriptions, these are the appropriate features of the component crossbar. And this is not necessarily the terminology you would expect in 11th century insular manuscripts. It's whatever is appropriate for your own discipline. And then we get into the problem of how do we connect our terminology And then we get into ontologies and linked open data and stuff that I'm not talking about. But this is to showcase kind of what I've come up with in the context of epigraphy, where you expect certain terms to make an appearance, and other terms which would be appropriate for a manuscript would be completely irrelevant or unnecessary for an inscription. Right, then as Peter showed already, once you've designed your categorization list, you start annotating, you draw a box around a letter, and then you define it, ticking the various components and features you have already defined. And then you can start comparing your graphs in this very cool way, where you can see the hand, the place, the date, in this case repository, and you can start, within the same text I have an alpha both with a cross and with a straight bar, what's going on, that kind of thing. Okay, and also to superimpose for further comparison various things, make them transparent, put them together, see if they actually match. So this is what Archetype does. Oh, and yes, and you can export collections of things. Look at all my alphas, aren't they amazing? So what am I doing to Archetype to make it work for epigraphy? So the first thing something to remember, because it will come up again towards the end of my presentation, is that Archetype basically is a relational database, which means that the information is stored into separate tables, so one table for place names, one table for letterforms, one table for owners, one table for repositories. All of those things are stored into separate tables. To connect the information, the data, across tables, you need a third table to connect the two existing ones. Excuse me. So, example. Oh, yes, thank you. Example, I have one table with character components that I have defined, apex, ascender, whatever. I have another table with features, excuse me, features that can describe further these components. And I have a very long table called component features, which puts them together. So my crossbar can have these several features, because these features can also be applied to other components, right? Serif could be on an ascender, on a descender, on various things, not only on a crossbar. But this is how I'm saying, okay, my component crossbar can have the following features. Does that make sense? It will come up again. Okay. So, again, being not really a palaeographer, I had to kind of train myself to think of the letter shapes like this. In epigraphy, we use letter shapes, again, for dating, just as all the rest of you do. However, the dating is not always as precise, and how do we arrive at dating by letter shapes? We usually go by inscriptions who have a date mentioned in the text or undisputable archaeological context. So we can say, from this century on, the sigma tends to have this shape. Right, tends to have, right? It's not super precise. Of course, it's more fun if the Latinists and the Hellenists have their own traditions of calling things. But what I'm trying to do is use the same terminology for both alphabets so that I can compare them, the H and the eta, that kind of stuff. I have to call them the same way. We also come into the question of the various publishing traditions. Where do epigraphers talk about letter shapes? In several places, possibly, depending on your edition, on your tradition of publishing. Some people just mention it briefly in the physical description. Like in this inscription, we have 3 square sigmas, full stop, that's it. No further palaeographic analysis, because it's not the focus of the publication. It's not super important. Some things, like ligatures, we normally put in the apparatus criticus, which may sound very odd to people, but we don't normally have more than one copy of an inscription, so we don't talk about witnesses the way manuscript people do. So in the apparatus, we do readings, variations, weird stuff like this. Or just in the commentary. So you can find the palaeographic information in various places. It's not super obvious where you're going to look for it when you actually open your epigraphic edition. So that's another discipline-specific thing to think about. And of course, in our modern languages of publishing, we call things in totally different ways. Something is a stroke or a bar or a haster or a descender, same thing, but we have various ways of calling it, which comes back to Peter's ontology proposal of systematizing and kind of linking my term to your term. In terms of the object description, I've also made some changes because, again, the physical description of a lapidary manuscript, let's call it, is different than that of a papyrus for obvious reasons. So some of the stuff, I deeply care about the material of my inscriptions. It's not all necessarily marble. And the material and the surface, to an extent, predefines the type of font and execution that we're going to see, because marble is soft and nice, and you can make loops and beautiful things in it. Granite is super hard and it's a bit more choppy. That's not because the stone cutter was useless, it's because the surface is much more difficult to inscribe. So all of that comes into account here. So this is, again, just an example of things that I never thought about when I was doing my epigraphy course, but then I had to think about when I started doing palaeography, that the fact that the diagonal stroke of the N can have various shapes and forms, and I have to use consistent language to describe them. It's just an example. Okay, the changes I've made to Archetype. One of it, as I mentioned, is the object description. We have a different kind of tradition of doing the date, just visually the way the date appears in a publication than manuscript people, so things like that, which are just changing the back end, no programming for that, just change something slightly. Provenance is quite different because I'm not working with a private collection, so I don't have things like owner and that kind of thing, but I do have sometimes 4 locations for a monument, depending on what's happened to it in its history. So by original location, I mean, where was it actually put up originally? Find spot, we could have been the same, right? We find it within its own archaeological context, or we find it after it's been transported, sold, lost, found again, etc. Could be a totally different part of the country. Repository is the institution which issues its inventory number, and that's not necessarily its current location. It could be somewhere out in the field, but still have a stamp from the Museum of blah blah, meaning its repository is Museum of blah blah, its current location is the village of X. So all of these things can happen, and so I've given the various locations ID numbers. 1 is always find spot, 2 is always modern location, and so on, so I can filter and search, etc. I'll show you that in a minute. So where does Python come into it? So first to say that Python doesn't have anything to do with the snake. It was named after Monty Python. Just thought I'd say that because I like it. So Archetype is written in Python. So if you know a bit of Python, you can poke at Archetype, customize your own things. Some things are more fiddly than others, but I'm not a developer and I can do it with a bit of reading and crying and chocolate and help, so it's possible. So this is probably the shortest introduction of Python I've ever done, but basically the code of Archetype is written into blocks like Lego, construction, box. You build one on top of the other, following rules, etc. So if you want to, let's say, change the order of the columns in a table, you can change the building blocks order, and it does the job for you. The main thing is that if you want to execute an operation multiple times, you just give it a name, you put it as if it's a shoebox, and then when you need it, you just open it again, do the thing 100 times if you need to. The main thing that I'll show you, so there are plenty of data types in Python, we don't care about them today. What I want to show you is the use of lists and dictionaries, especially dictionaries. dictionaries, not in the linguistic sense, but in the programmatic sense, meaning you have a key and a value that belongs to that key, and to get to the value, you need to point to the key. And this is an example. So originally, when I first installed Archetype, the original place, what I call original place, was called medieval place, which for me doesn't work because not doing medieval stuff. So I wanted to change the label of that thing in the interface. So what you do is basically you go to your shoebox, which is the place of the graphs section of Archetype, and you pick the key, which is label, and you change the value of the key label to original place. So this doesn't mess with my searching, because everywhere in Archetype we still call it hand place. This is just the output on the screen, the title, the label of this box we see on the screen. So this is the easy one, right? Just changing labels, how things are called. And I've applied this in various places in the description of the object. So inventory number, which we use in epigraphy, that was originally called shelf mark. I was like, I don't have a shelf mark for an inscription, right? Doesn't make sense. So things like that you have to customize to fit your disciplinary expectation. And the other thing was in the search facet. So Archetype has an amazing search functionality. One of the things is faceted search. Again, this is my original place, which used to be medieval place, right? I'm not changing anything in the functionality, simply the label of this box. Okay, something a bit more complicated. You remember when we talked about relational database and combining data from different tables, right? So that's a bit tricky. And again, I'm not a developer, so maybe for some of us it will be a piece of cake. It took me a while to figure it out. So basically, you need to create something that behaves like a table, but it's not actually a table, and then you can put it into the table where you want it. And my example is with find spot. So find spot, I wanted to put in the general search table. I'll show you a screenshot of that in a moment. Find spot comes from a different table, but I wanted to put it in the main search result table. So I had to create a model which says put here the content of the item origin, original place, etc. And then this content in another file, I said, okay, now in this place at the table between columns A and B, put me the content from this model, which I defined over there. So again, going into the boxes way that the code works, I create one box and stick it where I need it to go. I know that's a bit weird, but this is what I mean, okay? So this is my main search result table. On the left, I couldn't fit everything on the screenshot, but on the left I have the various facets, location, date, original place, repository, language, all of these things that I can search through, I have normally on the left. And this is the result I get when I start searching through my corpus. So what I've done is put this column here between reference and date, whereas before it didn't exist at all, it wasn't there. So all of this results into this, which is what you would expect in an epigraphic publication. The first thing you need to know is where the thing was found and the date, stuff like that. So that table, I tweaked it, changed the order, called things in a different way to make it fit my disciplinary expectations, as it were. So this is the gist of it. I really wanted to show some Python, so sorry for that, but it's super exciting. So the next thing that I'm doing is customizing the search in a similar fashion so that I can compare the Greek and the Latin letter shapes. I already use the same terminology for them, but I can, for the moment, search separately through the Latin, through the Greek. One thing I'm working on is to be able to say, show me everything, regardless of alphabet, which has a broken crossbar. So I can compare my H's with my Etas, my alphas with my A's, and so on and so forth. So that's forthcoming. There will be a lot of Python going on, a lot of chocolate, I think, in my future. But yes, that's the next step, so that I can have a nice kind of list of graphs that I can compare between the two alphabets that I have. Thank you.